this is Kate from the Library of Whispers, and today we're going to take a second look at this lovely vintage book. It is a history of everyday things in England, done in 4 parts, of which this is the first, 1066 to 1499. And it was written and illustrated by Marjorie and C. H. B. Quinnell. So I have all 4 volumes of this lovely book. Now, I first started reading this book about 10 months ago, and I'm very sorry that I didn't follow up on it, but here we go. So we had started chapter 1, the 12th century. Now I'll put a link to the first video in the description of this video, so you can catch up if you want to, or you can simply just keep on watching this video. It's up to you. Okay, so we were talking about the construction of the Norman Hall, or Great Hall, and this is one at Hedingham. It's a 14th century hall. Okay, let's begin. The windows of the Great Hall were very narrow, and of course did not have any glass. At night, or when the weather was very bad, they were closed by wooden shutters, but during the daytime the wind must have blown through, and the draughts and smoke made what we should think a very uncomfortable house. The fireplace, built on an outside wall, had what is called a flue, or escape for the smoke, but this, instead of going up and finishing above the roof level in a chimney stack, as flues do nowadays, was carried at an angle through the thickness of the wall and came out into the open air behind one of the buttresses. The gallery, which runs round the whole hall, was reached from the staircase in the angled turret, and must have been used for seeing what was going on in the hall below. The gallery is contrived in the thickness of the wall, and so takes up the space which is used for the little rooms on the other floors. It is a very beautiful feature, and adds greatly to the appearance of the hall. The furniture of this period was very simple, and consisted of tables on trestles and benches rather like school forms. There would have been 1 or 2 heavy chairs roasting at another. And then serving dinner through a doorway into the hall, and in rather an amusing way they take the food in upon the spits on which it has been roasting. Can you see that? They look like kebabs. Musicians often preceded the servants and played while the meat was being served. Harpers came and recited romances. Minstrelsy was in high repute among the Normans. The king had a minstrel, and every gentleman of position maintained one or more as part of his household. Bands of acrobats and tumblers came and gave displays. Now this is a little illustration of some jugglers. Before we leave the Norman Great Hall, attention should be drawn to the zigzag ornament around the arches. The design is called the chevron pattern, and like the slender columns in the angles, is a sign of Norman work. The drawing on figure 10, which is here, shows the circular staircase in the angle tower of the keep. This was all built in stone, and a tumble downstairs must have been a painful experience. Each step had a circular piece worked on it at one end, and at the other was long enough to be built into the wall. The front edge of one step was laid on the back edge of the one below, and the circular piece in the centre fitted exactly over the one underneath, and in this way formed the central stone column, or newel. For a long time, most staircases were like this one. The nobles probably had their manor houses as well, in much the same way that the convents had granges on their outlying estates. In Jocelyn's Chronicle, a wonderful manuscript of the 12th century, we read how Abbot Samson narrowly escaped being burned to death in 1182 when staying at one of his granges, the only door of the upper story of the house being locked and the windows too narrow to admit of escape. This sounds as if the abbot was in the solar of a house, rather like that illustration in figure 55, and which by that time had become typical of the 13th century. It is to these granges that we must look for inspiration as to how houses became more comfortable and less castle-like. It must needs have been a very courageous baron who would molest Abbot Samson, capable as he was of bearding girdily on himself, so when the granges were planned, it was not so necessary to consider defence, and comfort could be studied. The monks appear to have followed a much older building tradition than the Norman castle. In volume 4 of our Everyday Life series, we suggested that the Anglo-Saxon hall, which is described in Beowulf, was rather like a glorified aisled barn, and this hall remained as the central feature of the English house until the time of Elizabeth. When the monks planned their granges, they followed the old Anglo-Saxon buildings, and you can see the same idea in the living part of their monasteries. See plan figure 13, which I think is probably going to be on the next couple of pages. The monks' warming room was in the solar over it. The hall suggested the refectory, and the kitchen and offices remained in the same position. The nobles, when visiting an abbot and staying at one of his granges, would be struck by the greater convenience and comfort of such a house, and so would follow it when building their manor houses, adding more defensive works than would be necessary in the case of the abbot's granges. The manor house at Boothby Bagnall in Lincolnshire is a happy survival of a small 12th century manor house. Here it is. The heiress of the Boothbys married one of the Bagnall family from Newport Bagnall in Buckinghamshire. The arrangement is typical, a vaulted lower story used as a cellar, without any connection with the upper living floor, which is reached by an outside staircase. Just here. There are nice windows and fireplaces on both floors, connecting with a large chimney. As well, we find that halls were built inside the curtain walls of the castles, in addition to the keeps. This was the case with what is now called the Norman House at Christchurch, Hampshire, built between 1125 and 1150. In Beowulf, the hall was obviously on the ground floor, but in the Bear Tapestry, Harold is shown dining in a hall raised up to the first floor on a vaulted undercroft, with stairs leading up to the hall outside. This was done at Christchurch and made it possible to have larger windows to the hall than if it had been on the ground floor. There appears to have been a kitchen at one end of the hall and a tower for the guard-robes, and that is all. We illustrated this Christchurch house in Volume 4 of the Everyday Life series, and we recommend our readers to go and see it. Well, we might just do that. So far as the towns were concerned, there is a rather amusing and graphic picture of London and its work and play, written by Fitzstephen, who lived in the reign of King Stephen, wrote in the reign of Henry II, and deceased in 1191 in the reign of Richard I. We give a few extracts below. A description of the most honourable city of London, the situation thereof. Amongst the noble cities of the world, honoured by fame, the city of London is the one principal seat of the Kingdom of England, whose renown is spread abroad very far. But she transporteth her wares and commodities much farther, and advanceth her head so much the higher. Happy she is in the wholesomeness of the air, in the Christian religion, her munition also and strength, the nature of her situation, the honour of her citizens, the chastity of her matrons, very plentiful also in her sports and pastimes, and replenished with honourable personages, all which I think meet severally to consider. The temperateness of the air. In this place the calmness of the air doth mollify men's minds, not corrupting them with lusts, but preserving them from savage and rude behaviour, and seasoning their inclinations with a more kind and free temper. On the strength and site of the city, it hath on the east part a tower palatine, very large and very strong, whose court and walls rise up bucks and does, wild boars and bulls. Of the fields, the arable lands are no hungry pieces of gravel ground, but like the rich fields of Asia, which bring plentiful corn and fill the barns of those that till them with a dainty crop of the fruits of Ceres. Of the wells, there are also about London, on the north of the suburbs, choice fountains of water, sweet, wholesome, and clear, streaming forth among the glistening pebble stones. In this number, Holy Well, Clerkenwell, and St. Clement's Well are of most note, and frequented above the rest, when scholars and the youth of the city take the air abroad in the summer evenings. A good city, when it hath a good lord, how the affairs of the city are disposed. There is in London upon the river's bank a public place of cookery, among the wines to be sold in the ships and in the wine cellars. There, every day you may call for any dish of meat, roast, fried, or boiled, fish both small and great, ordinary flesh for the poorer sort, and more dainty for the rich, as venison and fowl. Of Smithfield, without one of the gates, is a certain field, plain or smooth, both in name and situation. Every Friday, except some greater festival come in the way, there is a brave sight of gallant horses to be sold. Many come out of the city to buy or look on, to wit, earls, barons, knights, citizens, all resorting thither. It is a pleasant sight there to behold the nags, well fleshed, sleek and shining, delightfully walking. The pests of London. The only plagues of London are immoderate drinking of idle fellows, and often fires. Sea fights. In Easter holidays, they counterfeit a sea fight. A pole is set up in the middle of the river, with a target well fastened thereon, and a young man stands in a boat which is rowed with oars and driven on with the tide, who with his spear hits the target in his passage, with which blow, if he break the spear and stand upright, so that he hold footing, he hath his desire, but if his spear continue unbroken by the blow, he is tumbled into the water, and his boat passeth clear away. Summer sports. Upon the holidays all summer, the youth is exercised in leaping, shooting, wrestling, casting of stones, and throwing of javelins, fitted with loops for the purpose, which they strive to fling beyond the mark. They also use bucklers like fighting men. As for the maidens, they have their exercise of dancing and tripping until moonlight. Sport upon the ice. When that great moor, which washeth Moorfields at the north wall of the city, is frozen over, great companies of young men go to sport upon the ice, then fetching a run, and setting their feet at a distance, and placing their bodies sideways, they slide a great way. Others take heaps of ice, as if it were great millstones. Some are practised to the ice, and bind to their shoes bones, as the legs of some beasts, and hold stakes in their hands, headed with sharp iron, which sometimes they strike against the ice. And these men go on with speed, as doth a bird in the air, or darts shot from some warlike engine. A good deal of information can be gathered from building regulations issued in London in 1189, in the time of Richard I. Houses before that time had been very generally built of wood, and roofed safer than those of wood. There are long descriptions of stone party walls, those between the houses. These are to be 3 feet thick and 16 feet high, so the houses could not have been very high, and apparently the rest of the house continued to be built of wood. The accommodation appears to have been a hall or house place on the ground floor, with perhaps a lean-to addition at the back for a kitchen, and the solar or private room, a mere loft over the hall and lighted by a window in the gable at the front. These would have been formed naturally, as the roofs sloped down towards the party wall at each side of the house. A 12th century street, then, would have been made up of a series of rather low gables, side by side, the gutters between spouting water onto the pavements under during a storm. Some of the houses would have been higher than the others, because in those early bylaws of 1189 you are allowed to raise your half of the party wall if you want to do so. In the country, the villains' cottages will be much the same, a simple oblong building with a house plate and perhaps a small shed or kitchen at one end and a loft over. Again, before we think of such accommodation as very rough, we must remember that people were used to living in the open air, and like sailors nowadays, only caught colds when they went indoors. For example, the monks had the best opportunity of being comfortable, yet they passed most of their time in the cloisters, which were open in those days, and not yet filled with any glass. Some Norman street houses at Lincoln, one of them known as the Jew's house, are still lived in. It is remarkable to think of their record of 800 years' habitation. Now the next thing to consider is, how did William rule? He waged war successfully and was a great soldier, built castles and fortified towns, but he must have been able to do more than this, or he would not be remembered as a great man. His claim to greatness lies in the fact that he did what even the Danish wars had not been able to do, bound the country together as one by the feudal system. William's followers were rewarded by large grants of land belonging to the Anglo-Saxons who were slain at the Battle of Hastings, and to others whose estates were confiscated, and these lands they held direct from the king, and in return were bound to supply so many soldiers at the king's call. This is very interesting because later on people began to pay money instead of giving their services in this way. But in the Great War of 1914 to 1918 we had the same rule, that you must fight for king and country if you enjoy the privileges of citizenship. It was not until the conquest that England was supposed to belong to the king. The Saxons always had the tribal idea that land belonged to the community, and they held it by adventurous life in those early days, when it is realised that what we now call a cathedral was then in some cases only the private chapel of a convent. The cloisters and a few of the other buildings may remain, but what we now see is only a part of the original whole. Our plan on page 29 will explain this. We'll check that one out. Where the monastic church was used as a cathedral, it was called a conventual cathedral. The bishop took the place of the abbot and had the right to preside in the chapter house. The prior and convent looked after the buildings and continued to do so until the time of Henry VIII, when they were replaced by deans and chapters of secular canons. Cathedrals of the old foundation had deans and secular canons from the start. It may help if an explanation is given now of terms which will be frequently used in later pages. A cathedral is the bishop's church and the principal one in a diocese. A diocese is that part of the country over which the bishop rules. A see means the seat of a bishop, or where his cathedral is. The parish originated with the holding of the Lord, and his chaplain was the parish priest. The king's chaplains became the bishops. Then it is very usual to talk about a house for monks as a monastery and one for nuns as a convent. This is wrong. Convent is the term applied to the whole body, either of monks or nuns, and the monastery means only the actual group of buildings, and it is used both for the houses of monks or nuns, though the latter can also be called a nunnery. Figures 12 and 13 show a 12th century Benedictine monastery, so I think that must be over the page. Yeah. One is a plan and the other a bird's eye view, and the plan has numbers which correspond with those in the text and will enable the uses of the various buildings to be followed. Top of each picture is the north, the right hand side is the east, the left hand the west, and the bottom the south. So starting at the left hand or to the west, where one is marked, we enter the gatehouse into the great court. Here all were free to come who had any business to do, and it must have presented a busy scene, crowded with pilgrims, knights and men-at-arms, merchants and minstrels. There was a porter at the gatehouse to guard. At 2 was the almonry, where alms were given to the poor, as sometimes there was a school close by for poor children. At 3 were the stables and granaries. Here the horses of the guests and travellers were put up. It is doubtful if there were many inns in England where travellers could obtain food and lodging until the middle of the 14th century. In the towns there were alehouses, cook-shops and hostelries, because a little later in the time of John, 1212, we read that after a fire all alehouses be forbidden, except those licensed by the Common Council, and that no baker, bake, or alewife brew by night with reeds or straw, but wood only. Also, all cook-shops be whitewashed. So let's have a little look at these pictures on the top here. Figure 12, exterior of a Benedictine monastery. And then on the opposite side we have figure 13, a plan of a Benedictine monastery. So let's go through these. So here is one. In fact, I'm going to is the church. And 8 here goes all the way around in a square shape, is the cloister. And looking for 9, that little spot there, is the outer parlour. And 10 is here. That is the slipe or passageway. 11 is a small cloister. And 12 is the chapter house. And 13 is here. And 14 is the stores or cellars. 15 is the lavatories. 16. These numbers are very small. Oh, there it is. 16 is the warming room. 17 is the refectory. And 18 is over here. Kitchen and offices. 19 is the bakehouse, mill and brew house. Oh, and it goes round to there as well. And then 20 is the infirmary. 21 is the misericord. 22 is the infirmary chapel. And 23, I think that's 23, is the infirmary kitchen. And then 24 is the cemetery. And 25 is the gardens and fish ponds. Okay. So back to the reading. It was part of the duty of monks to entertain strangers. Their accommodation was divided up just south of the gatehouse. At number 4 was the place for the poorer guests and pilgrims. At 5 would be placed the merchants and like folk, and at 6 was the abbot's or prior's lodging, where nobles or the king would be entertained. Jocelyn of Brakeland's chronicle is interesting as it gives an idea of the great size of the 12th century monastery. He says that after Abbot Samson's installation, he retired to his chamber, spending his day of festival with more than 1,000 dinner guests with great rejoicing. Jocelyn also gives a note of how guests were entertained. When the abbot is at home, he is to receive all guests of whatsoever condition they may be, except religious and priests of secular habit, and except the men who present themselves at the gate of the court in the name of their masters. But if the abbot be not at home, then all guests of whatsoever condition are to be received by the cellarer, up to 13 horses. But if a layman or clerk shall come with more than 13 horses, they shall be entertained by the servants of the abbot, either within the court lodge or without, at the expense of the abbot. At 7 was the church, and the west door was generally placed opposite the gatehouse, so that on saints' days it could be opened for processions. The north door was used by the people when there were special services for them in the nave, but the monks used the choir which extended into the nave. At 8 was the cloister, and this was a very important part of the monastery. When we go round a cathedral now, to another video continuing this chapter very soon. This has been